The sky above Yanthari 6 burned orange and red, as another volley of Vreth plasma fire slammed into the crumbling walls of the ridge outpost, and Commander Elena Vargas pressed her back against the stone and felt the heat wash over her like a furnace door swinging open. She wiped the dust from her visor and looked down the line at what remained of her garrison, a mixed-species force of 400 soldiers holding a position that should have required 2,000, and every single one of them knew it. To her left, a squad of Caliph heavy infantry crouched behind a collapsed beam, their massive frames barely fitting behind the cover. Their gray skin cracked and bleeding from shrapnel wounds they refused to acknowledge, because that was the Caliph way. You bled, and you fought, and you said nothing about either. To her right, the Dravasi shield-bearers held their formation with grim discipline, their energy barriers flickering under the relentless barrage. Them, the Tassari scouts darted back and forth, carrying ammunition and dragging wounded soldiers to the medical station. That was really just a corner of a room with a single overwhelmed medic. The Vreth were coming again. Vargas could hear them before she could see them. The clicking and scraping of thousands of chitinous legs moving across the rocky ground, a sound like a river of knives flowing uphill, and beneath that sound the deep rhythmic pounding of their war drums, made from the hollowed bones of conquered species. That detail the Vreth did not try to hide, because terror was a weapon they used as deliberately as any gun. "Eastern Wall report," Vargas said into her comm unit. "Eastern Wall is holding, but barely," came the voice of Lieutenant Osei, tight with exhaustion. "We have lost 11 more in the last hour, and the Vreth are massing something big out there, Commander. I can see movement in the tree line that does not look like regular infantry." Vargas closed her eyes for 1 second, just 1 second, and in that second she allowed herself to feel the weight of everything, the exhaustion that lived in her bones, the grief for the soldiers she had already lost, the cold mathematical certainty that this outpost could not survive another 3 days without reinforcements that were at least 2 weeks away. Then she opened her eyes, and the weight was gone, because she had put it somewhere deep inside herself where it could not slow her down, and that was a human trick that none of the other species ever seemed to understand. Not the ability to ignore fear, but the ability to fold it up and put it in a drawer and keep working. High Marshal Torvan appeared beside her, ducking his enormous horned head beneath a doorframe that had been built for species much smaller than the Caliph, and his deep voice rumbled like stones grinding together. "Commander Vargas, my scouts report the Vreth have brought forward their siege engineers, the ones with the acid bore weapons that can eat through our walls in minutes. And if they breach the eastern wall, this outpost falls before sunrise." "I know," Vargas said. "Then you know we must consider withdrawal," Torvan said, and she could see it cost him something to say it, because the Caliph did not retreat. It was simply not in their cultural vocabulary. But Torvan was old enough and wise enough to know that pride was a poor substitute for survival. "We are not withdrawing," Vargas said. Torvan stared at her, and in his ancient golden eyes she could see the question he was too polite to ask. "What exactly do you think your humans can do here that my Caliph warriors cannot? Because you are small and soft, and your bones break easily, and you have no claws, and no venom, and no natural armor." And frankly he had never understood why the Galactic Concord had accepted humanity into the Alliance in the first place, except perhaps as a gesture of charity. "Marshal," Vargas said calmly, "I need you to trust me for the next 60 minutes. Can you do that?" "I can," Torvan said, because whatever doubts he held about humans, he had none about Vargas herself. She had earned that much in the months they had served together. Vargas switched to an encrypted channel that none of the Allied forces could access, a channel that connected to a single receiver somewhere in the frozen mountains above the ridge, and she spoke 2 words, "Reaper 1." There was a pause, and then a voice came back, calm, unhurried, steady as a heartbeat, speaking with a slight accent that placed its owner somewhere in the dry mountains of northern Mexico on a planet very far from here. Reaper 1 copies. You are cleared hot, Vargas said. Eastern Wall. Priority targets are officers and siege engineers. You have free engagement, and Alejandro, do not miss. I never miss, Commander. That? The line went silent. Vargas turned to Torvon and said, keep your soldiers behind cover for the next 15 minutes and watch the eastern approach. The Vreth assault came 10 minutes later. It was massive. Hundreds of warriors pouring out of the tree line in a clicking, shrieking wave, their bio-armor glistening under the orange sky. Their officers positioned just behind the front ranks, directing the attack with sharp gestures and pheromone signals. And the siege engineers lumbered forward, carrying the acid bore cannons that could melt through reinforced steel like water through paper. The first officer dropped. There was no sound, no flash, no warning. One moment the Vreth's senior commander was raising its forward limbs to signal the charge, and the next moment it simply fell. A neat hole punched through the center of its skull plate, dead before it touched the ground. The warriors around it hesitated, confused, and then the second officer fell, and the third, and then a siege engineer crumpled mid-stride as something punched through its acid cannon and into its chest. Torvon watched from the wall with his mouth slightly open. A fourth target dropped, then a fifth, each one a precise single shot from a direction that no one could determine, killing with a silence that was somehow more terrifying than any explosion. Because you could not fight what you could not find, and you could not hide from what you could not see. The Vreth assault did not retreat in an orderly fashion, because retreating in an orderly fashion requires officers to give the order, and all their officers were dead. So instead it simply came apart the way a machine comes apart when you remove every bolt at once, suddenly and completely, and with a lot of noise. Within 12 minutes it was over. 14 Vreth targets lay dead on the eastern approach, and not a single defender on the wall had fired a shot. The garrison that was not the silence of relief, but the silence of soldiers trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Torvon turned to Vargas, and his voice was very quiet when he spoke. What was that? We brought a specialist, Vargas said, and she did not smile, because there was nothing to smile about when people died, even if they were the enemy. But there was something in her eyes that Torvon had never seen before. A certainty, a knowing, a quiet pride in something ancient and perfected and utterly human. What kind of specialist? Torvon pressed. The kind you never see coming, Vargas said, and she walked away to check on her wounded soldiers, and left the old Caliph Marshal standing on the wall, staring out at the field of dead officers, and wondering for the first time in his long career whether he had fundamentally misunderstood what humans were. 3.7 kilometers from the eastern wall of the ridge outpost, high in the frozen peaks where the air was thin and the wind cut like a blade made of ice, Master Sergeant Alejandro Delgado lay perfectly still beneath a thermal blanket that matched the color and temperature of the rocks around him. He had not moved in 19 hours. His body was a single long line of controlled stillness, pressed into a shallow depression he had carved into the mountainside with his combat knife the night before. And his breathing was so slow and so measured that the frost forming on the ground in front of his mouth appeared and disappeared in a rhythm that matched the planet's own wind patterns, so that even a thermal sensor would read him as nothing more than a warm rock, slowly cooling in the night. His rifle lay in front of him like an extension of his own skeleton, a modified M117 long-reach magnetic accelerator rifle, human-designed and human-built, a weapon that used electromagnetic rails to launch a tungsten core projectile at 6 times the speed of sound, with no flash, no plasma signature, no energy bloom, nothing but the pure, clean physics of a heavy object moving very fast through the air, and arriving at its destination before the sound of its own passage could catch up. The aliens had abandoned kinetic weapons centuries ago in favor of plasma and laser and particle beam technology. And in doing so, they had forgotten, or perhaps never understood, what a simple piece of metal could do when delivered with enough velocity and enough precision. Delgado understood. He had been understanding it since he was 17 years old, and a recruitment officer had watched him put 5 rounds through the same hole at 800 meters with an old-fashioned powder rifle on a dusty range outside Chihuahua. And the officer had said, "Son, I think the military has a job for you." And Delgado had said, "Yes, sir, I think it does." Years later, he was the best at that job. Not because he was the strongest, or the fastest, or the smartest, but because he was the most patient. And patience was the thing that separated a good shooter from a great sniper, the way an ocean separates 2 continents. It was not a small difference. It was a difference so vast that most people could not even see the other side. He shifted his eye to the scope and scanned the Vreth lines below. The enemy was confused and frightened. And frightened enemies were dangerous, but also predictable, because fear made every species in the galaxy do the same thing. Cluster together, seek the safety of numbers, look outward for the threat they could not find, and in doing so, present exactly the kind of grouped stationary targets that a sniper dreamed about. But Delgado was not going to fire again yet. Not because he lacked targets, but because patience was a weapon too. And sometimes the shot you did not take was more powerful than the one you did. The shot you did, because every hour that passed without a kill was an hour the enemy spent wondering when the next one was coming. And that wondering ate at morale the way acid ate at metal, slowly, silently, and all the way through. Down at the garrison, the aftermath of the night's failed assault had created a strange atmosphere that was equal parts relief and unease. The Allied soldiers had survived, yes, but they had survived because of something they did not understand. And soldiers who do not understand what saved them cannot trust that it will save them again. High Marshal Torvon had spent the morning interviewing every sensor operator and scout in the garrison, trying to determine where the shots had come from, and he had come up with nothing. No trajectory data, no energy signatures, no acoustic profile. Nothing but 14 dead Vreth and a mystery. "The weapon is kinetic," said Kives, a young Tassari scout with enormous dark eyes and a mind that never stopped turning. "It fires a physical projectile, not an energy beam, and that is why our sensors cannot track it, because our entire detection grid is designed to identify plasma and particle signatures, and a metal slug moving through the air is invisible to everything we have." Torvon stared at him. "A projectile," he said slowly, as if the word belonged to a language he had studied long ago and mostly forgotten. "You mean a primitive ballistic weapon, the kind civilizations use before they discover directed energy?" "Yes," Kives said, "except there is nothing primitive about it." He pulled up a data screen and showed Torvon the entry wounds on the dead Vreth, clean, precise, each one placed in the exact anatomical location that would cause instant death for that particular caste of Vreth warrior, which meant the shooter not only had extraordinary aim, but also an expert understanding of Vreth biology. "This is not a weapon firing blindly," Kives said. "This is a surgeon operating at nearly 4 kilometers. Torvon was quiet for a long time. Later that day, he found Commander Vargas in the command center, and he sat down across from her, and he asked her to explain, truly explain, what a human sniper was. Vargas considered the question carefully, because she understood that this was not casual curiosity, but a senior military commander trying to understand a capability that had just reshaped his entire understanding of the battlefield. "A sniper," she said, "is a single soldier trained to deliver precise lethal fire at extreme distances while remaining completely undetected. And the training takes years, and it breaks most of the people who attempt it, because the physical requirements are the easy part. Lying still in the cold, controlling your breathing, reading the wind. The hard part is the mental requirement, which is the ability to be alone and silent and patient for days or weeks at a time, without losing focus or discipline or your mind." "Days," Torvon repeated. "The record for a continuous sniper deployment on Earth is 37 days, Vargas said. One man, alone, in a hole in the ground, watching and waiting, in conditions that would kill most humans who were not trained for it. Torvald leaned back and his massive frame made the chair creak dangerously. "My people are warriors," he said. "We have fought for 10,000 years across 100 worlds, and I have never heard of any species that fights this way, alone, invisible, patient beyond all reason. It is not how wars are fought." "It is how humans fight wars," Vargas said. "Or at least one of the ways. We have many." "How many more like him do you have?" Torvald asked. "Enough," Vargas said, and something in her tone told him that she was not being evasive, but was instead giving him exactly the answer he needed, which was that the number did not matter, was enough to change everything. That night, Kaives sat alone in his quarters and accessed the garrison's data archive and searched for the history of human sniping, and what he found kept him awake until dawn. He read about a Finnish farmer named Simo Haiha, who killed over 500 enemy soldiers in a winter war, using an old rifle with no scope, in temperatures that would freeze most species solid, and when the enemy sent their best counter-snipers after him, he killed them too. He read about a Russian soldier named Vasily Zaitsev, who turned the ruins of a destroyed city into a hunting ground, and became so feared that the enemy sent a special team across a continent to eliminate him. He read about Carlos Hathcock, and Chris Kyle, and Ludmila Pavlichenko, and dozens of others across centuries of human warfare, each one a single individual who had changed the course of battles through nothing more than patience and precision and the willingness to lie in the dirt and wait for the one perfect moment. And as the data scrolled past his enormous dark eyes, Kaives realized something that made his blood run cold. Humans had not developed this skill for alien wars. They had perfected it over centuries of killing each other, and now they had pointed it outward at the stars. On the frozen mountain above the ridge, Delgado watched through his scope as new shapes emerged from the Vreth lines. Tall, thin, multi-limbed figures that moved with a fluid, predatory grace that was different from the regular Vreth infantry. He recognized them from the intelligence briefings. Silkmaw hunters, the Vreth counter-sniper caste, bred for detection and killing, considered the deadliest trackers in the known galaxy, and they were fanning out toward the mountains with the clear intent of finding him. Delgado watched them come, and he felt nothing like fear, only the calm professional interest of a craftsman studying a new quarry. "Problem. Back, there you are," he whispered into the cold mountain air. "Took you long enough." The Silkmaw hunters moved through the frozen peaks like liquid shadows, their 6 limbs gripping the rock and ice with a precision that was almost beautiful to watch, if you could forget that every part of their biology had been bred for one single purpose: to find living things and end them. There were 8 of them, and each one stood nearly 3 meters tall, with elongated skulls that housed infrared sensor organs capable of detecting body heat through a meter of solid rock. And their lower jaws split into 4 mandibles that could taste chemical traces in the air, the way a human tongue could taste salt, faintly, distantly, but with absolute certainty. They were the best hunters in the galaxy, and every species in the Concord knew it and feared them accordingly. Alejandro Delgado watched them through his scope from a position 1,100 meters above and to the east of their search pattern, and he counted them carefully, noted their formation, studied their movement discipline, and made a plan. The plan was simple because the best plans always were. He was going to make them afraid. The first Silkmaw died on the second morning of the hunt. It had separated from the pack by approximately 200 meters to investigate a thermal reading on a south-facing rock shelf, and it was moving carefully with its sensor organs fully extended when a tungsten round, traveling at 6 times the speed of sound, entered through the base of its skull and exited through what served as its face. The remaining 7 Silkmaw reacted instantly. They dropped flat against the terrain and activated their natural camouflage, their skin shifting color and temperature to match the rock beneath them, and they held perfectly still for over an hour, waiting for a second shot that never came, because Delgado was no longer there. He had fired from a temporary position he had occupied for less than 20 minutes, and in the time it took the Silkmaw to process what had happened, he had already moved 600 meters north through a narrow crevice system that he had mapped 2 days earlier, during a brief window when cloud cover had hidden his movement from Vreth aerial drones. This was the fundamental difference that the Silkmaw did not yet understand. They were predators by biology. Their instincts were hardwired. Their tactics were patterns encoded in their DNA over generations of selective breeding, and they were devastatingly effective against prey that behaved the way prey was supposed to behave, which meant prey that ran or hid or froze. Delgado was not prey. He was a predator who had been trained to think like prey when it suited him, and think like a predator when that suited him instead. And the ability to switch between these two modes, to be the hunted and the hunter in alternating breaths, was something that no biological programming could replicate, because it was not instinct. Invention, not nature, but art. On the third day, he killed the second Silkmaw. This one he killed differently, because repetition was the enemy of a sniper. And the moment your opponent could predict your method was the moment you lost your advantage. He had spent the previous night placing a small thermal emitter, a device no larger than his fist, that generated a heat signature roughly equivalent to a human body, inside a narrow cave on the western face of the mountain. And he had positioned it carefully so that the heat would bleed out of the cave mouth in a pattern that looked exactly like a living being, trying and failing to mask its body temperature. The Silkmaw found it at dawn. 3 of them converged on the cave in a textbook encirclement pattern, moving with silent, coordinated precision. And the lead hunter entered the cave with its mandibles spread wide, to taste the air and confirm the kill. The thermal emitter had been placed beside a rock formation that created a natural choke point, and Delgado had positioned himself on a ridge 1,400 meters to the south, where he had a clear line of sight into the first 3 meters of the cave mouth. The lead Silkmaw entered the cave mouth and paused, its sensor organs detecting something wrong. The heat was right, but the chemical signature was missing. There was no scent of living flesh, no trace of breath or sweat or fear. And in the half-second it took for this information to travel from its mandibles to its brain, Delgado put a round through its thorax. 7 became 5. The 5 remaining hunters regrouped, and for the first time, Delgado saw something in their body language that he recognized, because he had seen it in every species he had ever observed under the stress of combat. The subtle shift in posture, the tightening of movement, the way they began checking behind themselves as often as they checked ahead. They were afraid. The ridge outpost. The garrison watched the Vreth main force with growing amazement, because the army that had been throwing waves of warriors at their walls with relentless aggression had simply stopped. Not retreated, stopped. The soldiers were still there, thousands of them, but they were not advancing, and they were not organizing, and their formations had taken on a loose, scattered quality that experienced soldiers recognized immediately as the look of an army that had lost confidence in its command structure. Because the Vreth command structure kept dying. Every officer who stepped forward to take charge of the assault became a target, and targets did not last long on a battlefield where an invisible shooter could reach out and touch them from 4 kilometers away with the casual precision of a man swatting a fly. Promotions had become death sentences, and the Vreth soldiers knew it, and their officers knew it, and the knowledge sat in the army like poison. Inside the garrison Kives, the Tesserae scout had become something between a historian and a haunted witness, spending every free hour studying human military records with the desperate focus of a scholar who has discovered that the universe is larger and more terrifying than he had previously imagined. He brought his findings to Torvon one evening. "They call it psychological warfare," Kives said. The humans have a concept that the purpose of a sniper is not merely to kill, but to create fear. To make the enemy believe that death can come at any moment, from any direction, without warning or mercy. And the fear itself becomes a weapon that degrades the enemy's ability to function as a fighting force. One soldier, Torvald said slowly, one soldier is doing this to an entire army. The humans have a term for it, Hives said. They call it a force multiplier. A single element that increases the combat effectiveness of everything around it by a factor far beyond its individual capability. Torvald looked out at the stalled Vreth army and shook his massive head. My people have fought wars for 10,000 years, he said. We have faced enemies with superior numbers, and superior technology, and superior weapons, and we have always understood the shape of the threat we faced. But this is something I do not have a framework for. The idea that one being alone on a mountain can break an army, without the army ever knowing where the breaking is coming from. On the 5th day of the hunt, Delgado killed the 4th and 5th Silkmaw in rapid succession. They had made a mistake. A small one. The kind of mistake that only matters when your opponent never makes mistakes himself, which is that they had allowed their search pattern to bring 2 of them within line of sight of each other, and within line of sight of Delgado at the same time. He fired twice in 4 seconds, shifted position, and was gone before the bodies finished falling. The 3 surviving Silkmaw stood in the frozen waste of the mountain and did something that had never been recorded in the entire military history of the Vreth Dominion. They stopped hunting. They turned around. They went back down the mountain. A Silkmaw pack had abandoned a hunt for the first time in the recorded history of their species, and the message this sent rippled through the Vreth army like a shockwave, because if the Silkmaw could not find this ghost, then nothing could find this ghost, and they were all simply waiting to die at the discretion of something they could not see or fight or understand. That night, the Vreth Field General composed an emergency communique to the Dominion High Command, and the words he used were words that no Vreth general had ever used before in any report from any battlefield. We are being hunted by something we cannot find, we cannot track it, we cannot predict it, we cannot kill it, and our Silkmaw hunters have abandoned the pursuit. I am requesting immediate strategic reassessment of this engagement. On the mountain, Delgado allowed himself a small sip of water and adjusted his thermal blanket and settled back into stillness. The wind blew, and the cold pressed against him like a living thing trying to push him off the mountain, and he ignored it, the way he had ignored cold and heat and thirst and exhaustion and loneliness for 22 years, because those things were just weather, and weather was just something that happened around you while you did your job. He had been on this mountain for 9 days now. He could do 9 more without difficulty. He could do 90 if the mission required it, because patience was not something Alejandro Delgado practiced. It was something he was. The request for a battlefield parley arrived at dawn on the 11th day, transmitted on the universal diplomatic frequency that all species in the galaxy recognized as sacred and inviolable. And when Commander Elena Vargas read the message, she allowed herself one slow breath before she turned to Torvald and said, "They want to talk." Torvald read the message with his golden eyes narrowing. "Overmind Sethkai," he said, and his voice carried the weight of recognition, because Sethkai was not a minor commander or a regional warlord, but one of the 7 highest-ranking military mimes in the entire Vreth Dominion, a strategist who had personally overseen the conquest of 31 worlds, and the fact that he was here meant the Vreth were taking this situation with a seriousness that went far beyond a single border skirmish. "He does not come to negotiate retreats," Torvald continued. "He comes to study problems, and we have apparently become a problem worth studying." The parley was arranged for midday at a neutral structure between the lines, a half-collapsed Yanthari communication tower that neither side had bothered to claim. And both delegations approached under the ancient conventions of galactic truce that even the Vreth had never violated, because some rules were older than empires, and breaking them invited consequences that no species wanted to face. The Concord delegation walked out under the orange sky in a formation that reflected the coalition itself. Torvon at the center, towering and armored, with Commander Vargas to his right, and representatives of the Dravosi, Tassari, and 3 other allied species flanking them, each one carrying no weapons as the convention required. The Vreth delegation was smaller, but more imposing. Overmind Sethkai stood at its center, and he was unlike any Vreth that Vargas had seen before. Tall even by their standards, with an elongated borax that spoke of the command, cast superior genetic engineering, and his compound eyes held a cold intelligence that was immediately obvious, the kind of intelligence that did not need to announce itself, because it simply radiated outward like heat from a star. Behind him stood 6 ceremonial guards, massive Vreth warriors in full bio-armor, who served no practical purpose at a truce meeting, but whose presence was intended to remind the Concord delegates that the Dominion's strength was not in question, even if the outcome of this particular engagement was. Vargas studied Sethkai, and Sethkai studied Vargas, and between them passed the silent mutual recognition of 2 professionals who understood that the real negotiation had nothing to do with the words that would be spoken, and everything to do with the information that could be extracted from how those words were delivered. Far above them on the frozen mountain, Delgado lay in his overwatch position, with his scope trained on the meeting site, finger resting 1 centimeter from the trigger, because a truce was a truce, but trust was a different thing entirely, and Vargas had not survived this long by believing in the good intentions of enemies. The negotiation began with formalities that were required by galactic convention, statements of authority, confirmations of truce boundaries, the ritual exchange of campaign honors that was supposed to establish mutual respect between warriors. Then Sethkai got to the point. "The Dominion is prepared to offer a withdrawal agreement," he said, and his translator rendered his clicking speech into flat, precise English that carried none of the emotional texture of the original, but conveyed the meaning perfectly. "We will withdraw from Yanthari 6 and halt expansion along this sector for 10 cycles. In exchange, the Concord forces will withdraw first and cede the relay outpost." It was a generous offer by Vreth standards, practically an admission that the siege had failed, and Vargas could see several of the Allied delegates shift with interest, because they were tired and wounded, and 10 cycles of peace along this border sounded very good to soldiers who had been sleeping in 3-hour shifts for nearly 2 weeks. Torvon considered it with the slow, deliberate gravity of a Caliph elder weighing a decision that would echo through history. But Vargas watched Sethkai. She watched his compound eyes, and the subtle movements of his mandibles, and the way his forward limbs kept adjusting their position, small, restless gestures that did not match the calculated stillness of the rest of his body. And she recognized what she was seeing, because she had seen it before, in human commanders who had come to a negotiation table not to negotiate, but to gather intelligence. Sethkai did not care about the territory. He cared about the ghost on the mountain. The formalities continued for another 20 minutes, and let the other delegates talk, and waited with a patience she had learned from years of working alongside people like Delgado. The patience of someone who knows that the most important moment in any exchange is the one your opponent cannot resist reaching for. And then it came. Sethkai raised one of his forward limbs in the Vreth gesture that requested a departure from formal protocol, a signal that what followed was personal rather than official. And the other Vreth in the delegation went very still, because an overmind-breaking protocol was extraordinary. He turned his compound eyes directly to Vargas. "Commander," he said, and his translator carried a new quality in his voice that might have been frustration or might have been something closer to awe. In the past 11 days, my forces have lost 14 senior officers, 8 siege engineers, and 5 Silkmaw hunters, all to an enemy we have never detected, using a weapon system we cannot classify, firing from a position we cannot locate. He paused. My Silkmaw hunters, the finest trackers the Dominion has ever produced. Hunters who have never failed to find their quarry in 300 years of service. Returned from the mountains, empty-handed. And I am told that 3 of them refuse to go back. Another pause, and this time the silence was so complete that Vargas could hear the wind moving across the broken landscape between the 2 armies. I did not come here to negotiate territory, SciFy said. And in saying this, he abandoned any pretense of diplomatic strategy, and spoke with the raw honesty of a military mind confronting something it could not categorize. I came here because I need to understand what I am facing. He leaned forward slightly. Commander Vargas, who is your sniper? The question landed in the silence like a stone dropped into still water, and every delegate on both sides of the table turned to look at the human commanders standing quietly among allies who were twice her size and 10 times her age. Vargas did not answer immediately. She looked at Torvald and saw in his golden eyes a curiosity as deep as Sethkai's, because the old marshal had been wondering the same thing since the night the eastern wall should have fallen and did not. She looked at the allied delegates, the Drovasi who had begun calling the unseen shooter Valtheris, the Tesseri scouts who had tried and failed to locate him, the Caliph warriors who could not comprehend how a single being could exert such force on a battlefield. She looked at the Vreth honor guard standing rigid behind Sethkai, elite warriors bred for combat, and she could see it in them too. Not fear exactly, but something worse. The deep, unsettling confusion of apex predators who had discovered they were not at the top of the food chain. And then she smiled. It was not a smile of arrogance or cruelty or triumph. It was the quiet, steady smile of a Kama woman who had carried a secret for 11 days and was about to watch it reshape the understanding of everyone in the room. Just a man, she said. One man, a rifle, and a lot of patience. Sethkai stared at her. That is not possible, he said. And yet here we are, Vargas said. Sethkai pressed forward because he was too intelligent and too disciplined to accept an answer that violated everything he understood about warfare. A cloaking system, he said, an AI-assisted targeting network, orbital overwatch relaying coordinates, some form of technology we have not encountered. One man, Vargas said again, and her voice was calm and warm and absolutely certain. No cloaking, no AI, no orbital support, just a human being with a rifle and training and the kind of patience that your species has never had a reason to develop. The silence that followed was different from the silences that had come before. It was the silence of a room full of beings recalculating the universe. Sethkai sat very still for a long time, and then he asked one final question, and his voice was quieter than it had been at any point in the conversation. How many more like him do you have? Vargas's smile widened just slightly. She did not answer. She let the silence do the work, because silence was a weapon too, and the answer that Sethkai's own imagination would provide was far more powerful than any number she could give. The parley ended. The Vreth withdrew their offer because the offer had been a pretext, and the pretext was no longer necessary, and both delegations walked back to their respective lines under the orange sky, and the ancient truce held, as it always did. Torvald walked beside Vargas and said nothing for a long time. Behind them, Kaives, the young Tessari scout, caught up and fell into step beside the human commander, and his enormous dark eyes were wide with a question he could not. "Commander," he whispered, "how many do you have?" Vargas glanced toward the mountains, where the frozen peaks disappeared into the clouds, and somewhere up there a man she could not see was watching them all through a scope and keeping them safe with a patience that was as old as the human species itself. "Enough," she said, and she kept walking. The Vreth army withdrew from Yanthari 6 in 72 hours. Not a negotiated withdrawal with terms and conditions and face-saving gestures. Not a tactical repositioning designed to regroup for another assault, but a full and unconditional retreat that left behind supply caches and forward positions and even some of their dead. And every military analyst in the Galactic Concord recognized it for what it was. An army that had lost not a battle, but something deeper. Something that lived in the space between courage and confidence, where a fighting force either holds together or falls apart. Intelligence intercepts confirmed what Vargas had suspected. Overmind Sethkai's report to the Dominion High Command had not merely described the events on Yanthari 6, but had reframed the entire strategic picture of the war. Because if one human with one weapon could paralyze an army of thousands, then every front where humans were deployed had to be reassessed. Every campaign plan had to be rewritten. Every assumption about human military capability had to be torn up and replaced with something that accounted for a threat the Vreth had never imagined. One sniper had not just won a battle. One sniper had changed a war. On the 13th day since he had climbed into the frozen peaks above the ridge, Master Sergeant Alejandro Delgado came down from the mountain. He walked into the garrison in the late afternoon light, with his rifle slung across his back and his thermal blanket folded under one arm, and his face raw and red from 13 days of wind and cold. And he was thinner than he had been when he went up, because he had been surviving on cold rations and melted snow, and the particular kind of stubborn endurance that human beings develop when they decide that comfort is less important than the mission. He did not look like a legend. He looked like a tired man who needed a shower and a hot meal and a bed that was not made of frozen rock. And that was perhaps the most remarkable thing about him, that there was nothing remarkable about the way he looked at all. Vargas met him at the gate. "Report," she said. 27 confirmed kills, Delgado said, his voice hoarse from disuse, because he had not spoken to another human being in 13 days. 14 officers, 8 siege engineers, 5 Silkmaw hunters, all logged with time, coordinates, and atmospheric conditions per standard protocol. The rifle performed within expected parameters, though I would like to note that the magnetic rail assembly needs recalibration after sustained cold exposure. I will file the technical report after I eat something. "Anything else?" Vargas said. "The Silkmaw were good," Delgado said, and he paused and thought about it, and then amended the statement. "They were very good, better than anything I have been up against before. I want that noted, because they deserve the respect." Vargas nodded, because she understood that this was not false modesty, but the professional assessment of a man who took his craft seriously enough to honor the skill of his opponents even after he had defeated them. "Get some food and some sleep," she said. "You earned it." "Yes, ma'am," Delgado said, and he walked toward the mess hall with the slow, careful gait of a man whose muscles had been locked in one position for so long that they had forgotten how to do anything else. He did not make it to the mess hall without interruption. The Allied soldiers had been watching for him, not obviously, not in formation, but in the way that soldiers watch for something they need to see, with their own eyes, before they can believe it. Standing in doorways and sitting on walls, and finding reasons to be in the corridor, between the gate and the mess hall. The Dravosi were the first to react. A squad of shield-bearers who had held the western wall during the siege stepped into the corridor and stood at attention, and pressed their hands over their hearts in the Dravosi salute that was reserved for those they called Valtheris, the unseen hand, the silent judgment, the guardian who strikes from the void. And Delgado slowed and looked at them with confusion, because he did not know what the gesture meant. "It is a great honor," Kiveth said quietly from somewhere behind him. "They have entered a new name into their living mythology because of you." Delgado frowned because he was not a man who was comfortable with honor or mythology, and he would have very much preferred to eat his food in peace. But he nodded to the Dravosi, because basic courtesy cost nothing, and they had held their wall bravely, and that deserved acknowledgment. Then Torvon appeared. The old Caliph Marshal stepped into the corridor, and he had to duck his enormous horned head to fit beneath the ceiling. And he stood in front of Delgado, and looked down at the human who was less than half his size, and who had just done something that no Caliph warrior in 10,000 years of warfare had ever accomplished. Torvon placed both fists over his chest, a salute that Kivas later told Vargas was called the Fist of Shaping, reserved exclusively for those who had moved the shape of a war, a salute that had not been given to a non-Caliph in living memory. "Sergeant," Torvon said, and his deep voice was formal and heavy with something that might have been wonder. "I have commanded armies across 100 worlds, and I thought I understood what one warrior could achieve. I was wrong, and I am grateful for the education." Delgado looked up at the massive alien and did the only thing that felt right. He nodded. Then he walked past and went to get his food, because he was very hungry, and that seemed more important than standing in a corridor being looked at. In the weeks that followed, the news of Yanthari 6 spread through the Galactic Concord like fire through dry grass. Military commanders from a dozen species requested detailed briefings on human sniping doctrine, and when they received those briefings, many of them had to request follow-up briefings because the first briefing had raised more questions than it answered. Questions like, "What do you mean they do this voluntarily?" and "How is it possible for a biological organism to remain motionless for that long?" and "Are you telling me this tradition is over 1,000 years old?" Formal requests came in from 6 Concord member species, asking for human snipers to be embedded in their forces as tactical advisors and force multipliers. And the United Earth Military Command approved most of these requests, because having your allies depend on your capabilities was good strategy and good politics. The Dravasi formally entered the word Valtheris into their cultural record, not as the name of a single person, but as a concept. The unseen patient guardian, the silent watcher, who strikes with perfect precision from a place that cannot be found. And they began teaching it to their children, alongside their other mythological figures. Except that Valtheris was not a myth. Valtheris was a human with a rifle, and that made the stories hit differently. Military academies on 14 worlds added human sniping doctrine to their curricula, and the instructors who taught these courses often struggled to convey the most important element, which was not the marksmanship or the ballistics or the camouflage techniques, but the patience, the terrifying, incomprehensible, almost spiritual patience that humans could summon when the mission required it. But the most significant impact was on the Vreth. The Dominion did not stop fighting, because empires do not stop fighting. That is not what empires do. But they changed how they fought on every front where humans were present. Officers began rotating positions every 30 minutes so that no high-value target remained stationary long enough to be zeroed, and this constant rotation degraded command efficiency by an estimated 40%. Formations spread wider, sacrificing the concentrated force that was the Vreth's greatest tactical advantage in exchange for making themselves harder to prioritize. And this spreading cost them coordination and speed. Vreth soldiers began exhibiting behaviors that their own psychologists classified as a new form of battlefield anxiety: constant scanning of distant terrain, reluctance to assume command positions, a pervasive sense of being watched that eroded morale in ways that no direct assault ever could. One human capability had forced an entire empire to rebuild its military doctrine from the ground up, and the cost of that rebuilding in efficiency and morale and strategic flexibility was greater than the damage 100 conventional battles could have inflicted. On a quiet evening, 3 months after, Yanthari 6, Vargas and Torvon sat together on the observation deck of a Concord warship and watched the stars move past in the slow, stately procession of faster-than-light travel. "I have been thinking," Torvald said, "about your sniper, and about what he represents, and I have a question that I have been reluctant to ask." "Ask it," Vargas said. "Does it not disturb you," Torvald said carefully, "what your people can do? The patience to lie alone in the cold for weeks, the precision to kill at distances that should be impossible, the psychological endurance to do it again and again without breaking. Does it not trouble you that your species has this capacity?" Vargas was quiet for a while, and the stars moved past, and when she spoke her voice was honest, in a way that honored the question. "It disturbs us too sometimes," she said. "We have been doing this to each other for 1,000 years, and the history of it is not something we are proud of. Difference. The thing that matters is that now we have chosen who to point it at, and why. And that choice is the thing that separates what we were from what we are trying to become." Torvald nodded slowly, and said nothing more, because some answers deserve silence. Far away on a distant front, a young Vreth officer stood before a room full of new soldiers who had never faced humans in combat, and he had been given the task of preparing them for what they would encounter. He dimmed the lights and activated a holographic display that showed a single human silhouette on a mountainside, barely visible against the terrain, just a faint outline that you could look at directly and still not quite see. "You will never see them," the officer said, and his voice carried the particular weight of someone speaking from experience. "You will never hear the shot. Your commander will simply fall, and then the next one will fall, and then the next, and when you send your best hunters into the mountains, after them, your hunters will not come back." The young soldiers shifted uncomfortably. "The galaxy has predators who are faster than humans," the officer continued. "Predators who are stronger and sharper and more durable and better armed by nature. Every advantage you can name, there is a species that holds it over the humans." He paused. "But no species in the known universe has ever mastered the art of killing from a distance, in silence, with patience, the way humans have. They did not stumble onto this skill. They did not develop it for us. They built it over centuries of war against each other. They refined it and studied it and passed it down from one generation to the next like a sacred tradition. They made it a science. They made it a discipline. They made it an art." He deactivated the display, and the room went dark. "Do not give them a reason to aim at you." The young soldiers sat in the dark and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. And across the galaxy, in the cold places and the high places, in the spaces between stars where the light did not reach and the silence was absolute, they waited. Patient and unseen and unyielding, humanity's oldest and most solitary warriors, lying still in the dark, with their eyes on the scope, and their fingers near the trigger, and their breathing slow and steady as the turning of worlds. And the galaxy had only just begun to understand what that meant.